Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Blight. I'm the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition here at Yale. Welcome back. This is, I believe, our first GLC at Lunch event of this semester. There will be numerous more to follow through the course of the semester, well into May. I want to quickly announce we're co-sponsoring tomorrow an event here on campus about the now much ballyhooed AP course put out by the College Board on African American Studies. It's at 4 p.m. in Luce Hall, if you haven't already found out about it. Kimberly Crenshaw will be on that panel, among many others, including, for some reason, yours truly. I'm thrilled, though, let's get to the point here. I'm thrilled to welcome Melissa Torres. She is our full semester Vincent Argiro Fellow in Trafficking and Modern Slavery, an initiative we have launched in the past year. We found Melissa, or she found us, through this broadening network of people who are scholars and writers and activists in this broad phenomenon of the study of human trafficking. We're thrilled to have Melissa here for the full semester, and she's teaching a course as well. She may say a word about that. She holds a PhD in social work from the University of Houston. She was an undergraduate at Houston Baptist College. She is currently at the Baylor College of Medicine and has been since 2019, where she is an assistant professor and a global health scholar. She's written all sorts of articles, as like the sciences and social sciences, some of them co-authored, on everything from wage theft to work safety to epidemiology and human trafficking to all elements of public health and human trafficking. And this is one very important thread of this story of trafficking, modern forms of bondage and slavery across the globe, and especially in labor trafficking. And this is what Melissa has worked on now for her short but fascinating career. So, Melissa, without further ado, welcome to all of you out there. Thank you to so many for attending. Melissa will speak for a half hour, 35 minutes or so, as usual, and then we will take Q&A and run a vigorous discussion at least until 1 o'clock, possibly a bit after. So, Melissa, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Blight. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Very honored for the fellowship and also for this opportunity to share my work. And so I will start sharing the screen so we can get started on the presentation to give everyone an idea. We'll be going through past experiences in working with the community, some research, program outreach, and that'll give an idea of the work that I've done, the lessons learned from that, and how that's led me to where I am and what I'm doing here at this fellowship, to give you an idea of what I'll be looking at and while I'm here in very cold Connecticut, coming from Texas. So again, thanks for joining. This is about the Latinx experiences of trafficking throughout the Americas. A little bit of background. I am an international social worker, also a community health worker. Previously at Baylor College of Medicine, also at the Menninger Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. They have one of the first hospital-based anti-trafficking programs, of which I was the research lead. Very much a public health response and protocols set in place for health settings and how to identify and respond to trafficking. Prior to that, I was at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm still an adjunct professor at University of Houston. I developed and taught the first class there in human trafficking and still teach it, along with a policy class from time to time. I have over 17 years of experience in anti-trafficking work. That's not where I thought my life or career would go. I started in direct services and have now led into research, policy, and training. I have an overlap with previous 10 years of HIV and AIDS work. And that's actually how I got into trafficking. I was working as an HIV tester when I came across the trafficking ring. And here we are today. I was born and raised along the US-Mexico border in a very small town called San Benito, Texas. And my current time and work is split between Houston, Texas, and the Rio Grande Valley along the border. Some other work and affiliations, I do work with federal offices, OTIP, JTIP, NITAC, and their expert network consultant. I was a fellow of their Human Trafficking Leadership Academy. I work a lot with Refugee Services of Texas, doing evaluations and consulting of their Survivors of Trafficking and Exploitation program. Formerly worked with the American Red Cross and the founding of the Latino engagement team, where we focused on specifically outreach and services, culturally responsive services to undocumented, mostly Spanish-speaking populations during crisis response. I'm currently the Vice President of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and also one of the delegates to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review on Border Militarization and Migration. So that's my experience at the multilateral level. And also something I'm proud of is I'm the consultant to the school district where I graduated from, working on a district-wide response to trafficking. And currently have other partnerships with international universities in Mexico, Colombia, and El Salvador. So my research and work agenda is violence and exploitation of displaced persons throughout the Americas, with a focus on exploitation and human trafficking. Largely for labor, have done research on sex, and we'll get into child soldiers as well. My drive is to bring attention to the risks and vulnerabilities, not just so much prevalence or where it's happening how, but what are the reasons, what led to this, where interventions that could happen or touch points that we could be intervening. And this comes from an understanding that violence is cyclical. And this goes for perpetrators as well. You know, there's the risks and the vulnerabilities and human rights violations that lead to these vulnerabilities that people then prey upon. So where is that line between the vulnerabilities and the risks, and where can we intervene? I very much come from a human rights lens and try to use the public health approach as opposed to the criminal justice approach, or in partnership with the criminal justice approach in some cases. So a few past studies that I worked on that I've highlighted because they have to do with where my study lies today here at Yale. These focused on displaced Latinos and youth. So at the University of Houston, I started as a graduate research assistant working on a study that looked at a longitudinal study of Mexican American tecatos, that's intravenous drug users. In doing interviews with them, finding out of the illicit activity, where they were buying drugs, where they were going. I learned a lot about spaces where there was a lot of illicit activity and migrants. And so that helped me get a little bit of entryway into some of the areas in Houston where we did the study. Then I started my dissertation based on experiences in my direct services, volunteering, and that study. It was Latinas and Latinos in the international sex trade. I did a qualitative study interviewing women who had been identified and certified as victims from cantinas, their service providers, which included investigators, attorneys, and social service workers or providers, and also the men who frequent cantinas to purchase sex, and got an understanding of how they view trafficking, how they viewed exploitation, and the experience of how it happens. At UT Austin, we did a statewide child sex trafficking study where we also, one of the main areas that we focused on was actually where I'm from, the Rio Grande Valley, and kids there that had been involved in forced criminality and getting their experiences. I'm currently still working on a study there, disrupting exploitation and trafficking in labor supply networks, working with day laborers, houseless domestic citizens, and a lot of also undocumented migrants who are in these very at-risk sectors, and getting their experiences of illicit labor practices. Again, with Refugee Services, I speak to the clients there and about their experiences and seeking services, how their past experiences impacts that. And also did a study looking at reducing injury disparities amongst day laborers and getting their ideas also of illicit labor. The studies that we just wrapped up at Baylor College of Medicine focused on outreach to at-risk populations in a free community clinic, and I'll speak a bit about that later. and also building capacity in the Rio Grande Valley in identifying and addressing the biopsychosocial needs of victims and survivors of trafficking. Main lessons that I've learned from the community that I'd like to share that I include in all of my studies and trainings that I give, I want to share today because a lot of them have brought me to realizing cultural differences that we've had as Latinos, that migrants have, being in a place where they're not sure of rights or languages or culture. So these are just a few things I'd like to share with you all as well, even though this isn't a training, but these are some things that I always keep included in my work. So the cultural and language misunderstandings and definitions of exploitation and trafficking have come up a lot. One of the most basic ones and one of my pet peeves is the use of tráfico, tráfico de humanos. It's just a literal translation of human trafficking, but in Spanish, it doesn't mean the same thing. Tráfico would be smuggling and contraband. And so a lot of confusion comes from that when I see people speaking with Spanish speakers using that language and the person is responding, speaking about the smuggling experience. And so then there's a misunderstanding and a cultural clash there and talking about it. It should be trata de personas, and trafficker is not traficante, but a tratante. So getting that language through with the community and speaking to them in that manner. A lot of use of trata de blancas. In my class, I always give the history of policies of trafficking here in the US, which started out with the White Slave Traffic Act. Well, that 112 years later is still being used among Spanish speakers where they still say, white slave trafficking, trata de blancas. And I have to explain that no, our community is at risk and what the difference is and how it should be called now. Something that's come up a lot in my discussions is the use of being obligado or obligadas or de fuerza versus, or as a choice rather. I've talked to a lot of both men and women who talk about either, situations where people are in or their own situations saying, no, nos tienen obligados, they have us obligated, or I'm obligated to be here, to be doing this. Sometimes they'll use fuerza, by force, but that doesn't translate to, it's not an understanding of being trafficked or exploited because there's this element of choice in that, and I came here, these are the only options I have, so this is my obligation. Having to really break down that understanding or normalization of the treatment is a challenge that, is constantly happening in discussions. I've added a few quotes in here that have really hit me across the years. One of the guys I was speaking to when I was asking about, if he knew what the difference or what labor trafficking was, if he had heard if human trafficking, he said sex trafficking. And I said, well, there's also labor. We were talking about it. And he was like, okay, well, it makes sense. Nosotros para el trabajo y drogas y es para el sexo. They were talking about gendering it. Yeah, okay, it makes sense. They exploit us, but that's the risk that we run. For us, we're going to get trafficked to either like sell drugs or work, and they're going to traffic women to sell sex. This is a phrase that I'm not a fan of, but it comes up a lot with the populations, and it's something I want to share, when I do these trainings. Soy ilegal comes up a lot. I'm illegal. That's again not phrasing or terminology it should be used, and the proper word would be undocumented. But it comes up a lot when I'm asking about the experience or how we can help or what kind of help they've looked for. It comes up a lot and is heard as rhetoric, towards them. There's still media that uses illegal aliens, that phrase. And it's how they identify, but this is also a tactic that's used against them by traffickers. You can't report anything. You can't tell anyone, no one's going to help you. You're illegal. What's going to happen? So that challenges us a lot in using a rights-based approach because they don't think they have rights. It's already ingrained in them that, being here undocumented means you are automatically a criminal, you're automatically illegal. And so your rights are just completely gone. And again, there's an assumption that I took that risk, and, one of the women I had talked to said it's actually something that a trafficker had told her, if something happens to you, if you tell anyone anything, no one's going to care. And she said, if I go missing, ¿a quién le importa? You know, it's mi riesgo. Who is it gonna matter to? This is the risk that I took. There's a lot of cultural values and understandings in restoration as well. No quiero molestar comes up a lot when I'm evaluating services and reaching out. Or if, you know, we identify a trafficking or exploitation situation, we want to help. I don't want to bother. I solo quiero avanzar. I just want to get past this. I just want to go through it. And a lot of this comes from no trust in law enforcement, in justice systems, and even healthcare education systems. This could be historical because of their own experiences in their own countries, or experiential here in the US. They did try and had, you know, face discrimination, face cultural or language barriers, excuse me. And so now there's just like complete mistrust. And so then the attitude becomes, you know, hay que trabajar. I'm just here to work. I just want to get this done and get through it. You know, if I can just get my money that they owe me, that's fine. I don't care. So this creates a lot of hesitancy in identifying, self-identifying, and, you know, identifying amongst them, reporting or seeking services, or even taking services. There's a lot of clients who won't accept certain services because they're like, give it to someone who needs it more. And then just this constant idea of living with criminalization, being undocumented or being assumed to be undocumented, being forced to work in illicit or unregulated jobs already adds to the idea that I'm a criminal because I'm undocumented and now I'm doing something illegal. Being taken advantage of, having traffickers or exploitative situations where basic stuff where, you know, I've heard of guys who had their documents. You have to provide a document to like rent tools at Home Depot. And people will come and tell the, you know, a lot of the workers like, well, we have to get you the tools, so give me your ID, you know, whatever ID they have on them, they'll take it. And then there's a mark on that person because the person stole the tools. Like little things like that are impacting them and even their ability to find any jobs. Or they're working in unregulated jobs, being told, hey, you know, by the way, we have OSHA coming on Friday, so none of you come in that day. We just have to have, like, if you don't have papers to be working here, don't come in on Friday. So there's a lot of people taking advantage of the situation and, you know, adding to those risks. And I hear this a lot also, you know, the ones that have the rights are them. What am I going to do about it? Something that came out of my dissertation that has been surprising to others, not always speaking to some of the survivors in the situation, is that male sex buyers are identifying female victims of sex trafficking. This is most especially if they're minors. We have this idea that sex purchasers are these evil, awful monsters and not other people and human beings with nuance. And that there's an assumption also because of a lot of this and the demand ideology that there's a demand for victims of trafficking. Sex purchasers, for the majority, you know, in general, believe that they're purchasing sex from someone who's willing, unless it's a minor. And this has been, even with investigators I spoke to, I did ask if this was more of an issue in the Latinx community. They said they do see it a lot more. But it's across the board with men when it comes to minors. If they, you know, if they purchase sex and they find that the sex worker looks to be under 18, that's where the majority of their intel comes from, is from the sex purchasers. I've had several guys tell me, yo vine para ayudar a mi hija allá. I came here because I have a daughter over there that I need to help. How can I come here and do that to someone? This is anecdotal, but I've heard of an increase in young coyotes. There's always been young kids involved in smuggling, but for some reason it's come up more in the last few years. A couple of guys have said that, you know, they don't get the same charges or consequences that adults would when it comes to getting caught along the border. And just a lot of discussion of like, you know, around chavo, around moro, like it was just this kid who was crossing us or kind of running the whole deal. Worst offenders in the community are cultural brokers, usually other Latinos who are born here, speak the language, you know, those barriers that you might have in mixed status or mixed cultural communities that are removed. And then a lot of what I hear as far as assumptions from responders to the community, is that the worst is behind them. Like, oh, these poor people, they're escaping the poverty and the violence and they faced it there, and don't think about the violence and the poverty that they then experience here, which adds to the risk and follows in that cycle that we talked about of violence and risk for exploitation. And also, one thing I hear about working and being from the border is that all human trafficking along the border is tied to cartels. No, human trafficking happens a lot of different ways with a lot of communities. So all that experience has led me to this fellowship. Part of that is teaching a class and also conducting research. So the class that I am teaching is in the program in ethnicity, race, and migration. And that's an undergraduate major. It's a seminar class. It's a small group of fantastic students. And they're very much interested in race, migration issues, how it applies to, you know, other either minors or other fields of study that they want to go into postgraduate. And I have a lot of first generation students like myself. I also wanted to share really quickly that all of the photos except for one screen are original photos that I've taken out in the field. So the class is called The Intersection of Rights and Risk, a Public Health Response to Human Trafficking. We have done introductions to human trafficking, human rights-based approaches, and public health systems. We're now going to be getting into epidemiology and social determinants of health, how those impact or how they interplay with human rights and impact risk for trafficking, experiences of trafficking, how it impacts mental health and migrant health. The responses faced by migrants, carceral responses, campaigns, and victimization, assessing risks, working in the communities, best evidence-based practices, and cultural challenges and implications. So the research, I want to give a little bit of background based on everything that I've said that I've worked in and the lessons learned. So a lot of this interaction I've had and work with the community and, you know, coming from that community. And also when I was at U of H, I co-led learning and study abroads to Latin America and got to work with a lot of researchers and social workers in those regions as well. So from these experiences, I've had so many discussions about La Traída, the smuggling journey, you know, either coming from or through Mexico and the Northern Triangle, the Darien Gap, and how that's impacted or further exacerbated a lot of vulnerabilities that migrants have. Recently, in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a major influx of unaccompanied minors at the labor sites that I go to. And so that kind of made me start looking at this as well. Comparing it to working with refugees who have fled conflict and the access and processes that they go through. Youth experiences with recruitment and perpetration. In the statewide study that I said that we did with minors, I talked to a lot of kids. All of them were currently in the criminal justice system because they had been charged with some kind of illicit activity, and talked about, you know, how they got into that, who kind of opened that door for them and got to learn about recruitment tactics. Also time that I spent in asylum seeking camps along the border, mostly in Matamoros, doing interviews and case consulting, and then again, visits with communities in Latin America. I've also been asked to assess a few cases, and there's one in particular that kind of brought this study up for me as well. Also coming from the border and experiencing the militarization over the years. And again, my role with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, we have some groups in Latin America working on one of our biggest issues is militarization. And so we have a group in Colombia doing amazing work, and I got to spend time with them on a couple of trips learning about that as well. So this is an iteration of a study that I actually wrote in 2014, which happened during a surge in unaccompanied children at the border. That year, the UNODOC Global Study on Homicide was also published. So they were looking at violent deaths, you know, which would be considered homicide, and then the different areas in which it would happen: killings in war and conflict, non-conflict deaths, and self-inflicted deaths. So this was a follow-up to a 2011 study because they needed more recent definitions to be using in the post-2015 development agenda. So this was kind of setting the precedent for that. And again, was comparing conflict zones to non-conflict zones. So in that, the biggest finding for me that came out was actually that Latin America is the most violent region in the world. About 90% of all homicides recorded worldwide were committed by male perpetrators, and men make up almost 80% of all homicide victims recorded worldwide. So in the common discussions of human trafficking, where we gender with women and girls being, the most at risk, how does this compare to the gendering of homicides in some of the most vulnerable areas and regions? So I was looking at these studies when they had come out at the same time that the surge was happening with unaccompanied minors. So again, now it's come out that Latin America is the most violent region in the world. And at the same time, unaccompanied minors were entering the border at a drastic increase from 2011, from 6,000 in 2011 to 60,000 being projected that year, 2013, 2014. 1 out of every 4 were under the age of 14. And the median age of homicides in the UNODC report in Latin America was 15 to 25. 77% of the kids that were presenting at the border were boys. The top 3 countries of origin were all the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, with Guatemala being the leading country of origin. And 48% of all these kids had claimed to be fleeing violence and organized crime. In 2019, a follow-up came up. So again, I first wrote the study in 2014 because I was interested in these 2 parallel issues happening. And so wasn't able to research it, was able to, again, visit Colombia, El Salvador, and Mexico and get more anecdotal information. 2019 comes and the follow-up to the UNODC report happens. Latin America still remains the most violent region in the world. Male homicide rate in the Americas is almost 10 times that of females. I think there was a 6% increase from 2013, 2019 worldwide for homicides. And then this comes out that there's more of a definition for crime-related homicide committed in the context of organized crime and gang violence, or homicide committed while perpetrating other criminal acts such as robbery and sexual assault. What came from this finding in this report is that organized crime kills as many people as all armed conflicts combined. Another finding this time, because they were looking and comparing to the development agenda, is that they were looking at the biggest risk factors in human rights violations. The first associated to these increases was poverty. It was said, the report says that poverty is a risk factor associated with violent crime and victimization at both the individual and national level. UNICEF has also declared poverty as the most likely factor fueling trafficking of children. So again, talking about that cycle and poverty, the idea that they fled poverty, they left it, but then still, facing it here adds to their vulnerabilities and risks of being re-victimized and trafficked here in the US. So now comparing this information that, has come out that it remains consistent about Latin America. We've had another surge in unaccompanied minors, and this one, I don't even think surge is the correct word. It's much larger. So the most recent report coming from Health and Human Services and ACF, from their shelter report, overcrowded shelters had received 122,000 unaccompanied migrant children. The total unaccompanied minors actually taken into custody at the border were 147,000. So 20-something thousand didn't make it into the shelters. Now, the previous record in 2019, just 2 years before the study, was 69,000. Of those kids, of the 122,000, ACF issued 673 eligibility letters to unaccompanied minors. That's letters stating that they have been trafficked. 74% of represented were for labor trafficking, 20% for sex, and 6% both. The majority, 371 boys, very close second was girls and 1 trans girl. So migrant kids and trafficking. If a foreign national minor is suspected of having experienced any kind of trafficking, there can be a request for assistance through OTIP. And if that eligibility letter is granted, it provides referral case management resources and possibilities for lawful presence. It's similar to non-refugee status. Yet recruitment, violence, and forced criminality are similar to child soldiers who can qualify for refugee or asylum status. Working with kids in that sector and working with kids in this sector, there was just a lot of overlap and similarities. So it just got me thinking and obsessed with, who is a child soldier? What is war? What's the difference here? At the multilateral level, including at the UN, child soldiers are recognized as a form of trafficking. However, TVPA, US federal law, also has similar language as the UN defining human trafficking for labor and commercial sex, but doesn't list child soldiers. The UN is one of the only member states of the UN who have not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does echo international criminal law definitions of child soldiers. We have our own Child Soldiers Prevention Act, which talks about how to assess child soldiers in conflict zones. And it makes mention of the TVPA as a protective status for child soldiers. However, TVPA doesn't make any mention of child soldiering. So I was interested in these policy gaps and thought, what constitutes a child soldier then? It very much looked the same, and that's the visual that I want to give you here in what I was seeing. This is the slide that has the two photos on each side are not originals. The one in the middle is. That's the actual original Geneva Conventions. So I started to do a policy analysis and looking at this in different understandings: international humanitarian law, international criminal court cases, international criminal law, Geneva Conventions. They all state that it's a war crime to recruit kids under the age of 15. Remember, I talked about the age of kids coming into fleeing the US were all under the age of 15, and those that are getting killed the most in the region are 15 and up. So I started doing just explorative research, looking at resources and responses in Colombia, research in El Salvador and in Mexico that have very similar situations of recruitment and violence. So in trying to compare the policies for two populations, and realizing that violence in Latin America, even though being the most violent, does not fall under international criminal law definitions for war. What separates a child soldier from the kids I was working with, both are dictated by militarized violence and staggering mortality rates. So to me, it looked like the violence was being defined and even categorized, like I showed in the UNODOC document, but the trafficking itself wasn't. So it also drives the question of what is militarism. The guerrilleros, maras, and cartels that I had heard about, talked to, researched, were all militarized, even using weapons sent from the US or other countries. Most of Central America and Mexico have experienced those increases in violence due to the presence of these groups. But unlike traditional war situations, there's no clear factions. There's no well-delineated political or ideological agendas, even though there is the rhetoric and the language being used. So this results in atypical and non-declared wars, and the US has no obligation to policy any kind of armed conflict. So meanwhile, and this is also an original photo, scientific research, news media, anecdotal information, photos that I was receiving, everything clearly describes a war-like situation in these settings. Talking to the people that are fleeing, that's what they feel that they're leaving. So children fleeing armed conflict in this region and seeking asylum at the US border have therefore been defined as an unaccompanied minor subject to deportation and possible return to that conflict, not given any kind of different status. So in a comparison of these experiences, I wanted to look at countries that had seen both. El Salvador had a civil war from 1979 to 92, had recognized the use of child soldiers, had used those tactics in recruitment, and then similar tactics were still being used by the maras in El Salvador and neighboring countries today to recruit kids into forced criminality. In the Colombian conflict from 1964 to roughly 2016-18, some say it's still going on, also recognize the use of child soldiers recruited by paramilitaries, guerrillas, and criminal groups during this time, and still currently facing that. And then the government actually funds deprogramming and reintegration resources for those victims. But similar tactics are still in use by those groups today. Just to give an idea, the Democratic Republic of Congo is considered a conflict zone using child soldiers. Nearly 500,000 refugees, given that refugee status, have fled that. They have a homicide rate of 28.3 per 100,000 people. The Northern Triangle has seen rates as high as 90.4 to 100,000. children fleeing these countries aren't considered child soldiers and aren't afforded those same protective statuses based on these experiences. And as we saw, there's also limited identification of that trafficking that actually happens when only 673 have been found. So that's what I'm looking at here in my study at the GLC. Basically, what does this mean for kids fleeing state or organized violence in Latin America? What are the difference between a terrorist state and a narco state? Exploring and comparing international humanitarian law and international criminal law definitions for what constitutes war, what constitutes criminal violence at the national level, child soldiers, and forced militarization of criminality. I'm exploring and comparing the interplay with federal definitions of responses and that policy analysis and looking at the gaps. Comparing recruitment tactics and expectations of recruited children, as well as the reasons they flee, and looking for those gaps in policy response and political priorities. So, so far here, I'm missing one, including I'm interviewing, interviews include lawyers, policymakers, and crisis responders. And so that's the presentation. I hope I got it in time. That's my email address if anyone has any questions, comments, would like to discuss, and I'll open it back up. Thank you all.
Oh, Melissa, thank you. We've got a lot of questions that have come in. I want to just frame it, if I can, quickly, and then go right to some of the questions. And I may ask 2 or 3 of them at once because they're related. You have presented here, seems to me, a fascinating case for this entire region, however broadly one wants to define it, from Mexico to through Central America into the Caribbean, as a war zone, as a state of war, right? And you've tried to lay out here the international protocols, the national policies, international policies that either help or thwart this. I just wanted to make sure that I'm hearing, because that is actually fascinating. And before we end here, I want to go to the questions. Before we end here, think about if you could write a speech. Don't answer this yet, but if you could write the next speech for Kamala Harris, who goes to Mexico or Guatemala or anywhere to address this question, what would the central point of that speech be on behalf of U.S. policy? Just think on that. But we got a bunch of questions here, and let me throw some of them to you. Who are these cultural brokers that you discussed, and why and how do they have so much power? That's one question. I'll give you a couple of these. And who determines eligibility, or how is eligibility determined for that letter that you addressed? And then there are more to come here. But how about those 2 questions first as part of the process?
So cultural broker is a phrase that we use for someone who can basically straddle different cultures. One of the things, if you see trafficking trainings, the red flags come up a lot. I have a lot of hesitation with those because I don't think they take culture into consideration. But a cultural broker would have those barriers removed. So in this case, one thing I hear a lot is the Chicanos. Talking to undocumented Spanish-speaking immigrants, when I ask, who are the people that they're seeing as taking advantage the most, they're like, oh, son los Chicanos, son los Latinos, son los pochos, basically the Latinos, American Latinos, who are born here or have lived here enough, speak the language, have papers or citizenship to be going back and forth. So that would be a cultural broker, because they can speak, with the situation, they can navigate the situation where the exploitation is happening along with those that are being exploited. And who determines eligibility? That would go through the Administration of Children and Families. They have OTIP, the Office of Trafficking in Persons, is the one who would review those cases and decide who gets the letter of eligibility.
A very practical question. Someone wants to know, can your slides be shared? We can put them up on a site because they found the presentation utterly fascinating. but a bit rapid, and they actually want your slides. Are you willing to put them up?
I'll have to go through and take information that's not yet published.
Okay,
I'm
okay.
still working on, but I can
Yeah.
definitely share the resources.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of numbers, a lot of policy, and so on. I think people really well. So you'll share whatever you can, I guess is.
Definitely will.
Are there any child soldier protection laws, or is there any legislation at the state level? That is, in the states of the Southwest, for example. Have any of the states tried to enact anything like this apart from the federal government?
That's a good question. I don't think there is, because it's under federal jurisdiction, because it would fall into foreign policy. So I don't know if that would be the case along border states, but it falls under federal jurisdiction. So I don't think there would be anything that could override that in defining them.
Okay, one viewer just wants you to know that he so greatly respects your heart for having the will to work on such a subject. So I just thought you'd want to, it's not a question, it's just an admiration. What about, this person asks about, what about gang violence in the US? Where boys get caught up in gun warfare and so on, in gang culture. Does this play a role in this problem on this side of the border?
Yeah. Yes, it's separately there. We have our own issue, and this is a population I work with, so that is my focus, but I definitely advocate for similar arguments with gangs here in the US with domestic victims, domestic meaning that they're just born here, they're US citizens or naturalized. But yeah, there is interplay, especially with the Maras. A lot of the gangs in El Salvador actually started in prisons here in the US for migrants who were imprisoned and banded together and started the criminal activity. So there is some interplay. There are connections. There are socios, associates of gangs and cartels that are working in either separate gangs, both prison and street as well.
Okay, thanks. We have a question here from our dear friend Lou DeBaca, whom I know you know. Lou, and thanks, Lou, for attending, as always, our former modern slavery fellow here. He'd be curious to know how the Yale students in your class are responding to these issues, what they're reading, what they're learning. How are they confronting what they're learning? Your thoughts thus far? You've only taught for 2 weeks or 3, I guess.
Yeah, we just had our 3rd class yesterday. But one of the assignments that I have is every 2 weeks, they have to send me, they have to get into small groups and send a reflection on the discussions and readings, just so I can see what questions they have so we can incorporate into class. Two of the groups came back and said that they felt this was the first class in their Yale experience that was something that they could translate into their daily lives, that it went beyond their career. So that was really cool to hear, because that's exactly what I want them to get. Towards the end, when we talk about implications, I want to talk about how they can use this information in the work that they're going to be doing in their careers, but it's a daily thing as well, in the communities we come from. I've actually had 2 students share with me that they think their parents were trafficked, their kids of immigrants. One of them said that her dad won't talk about it, and the other one said that just from a few things that her mom has said, she thinks it's kind of happened, but that they didn't have the language. And I can totally relate to that. Coming after I started learning about trafficking, a lot of light bulbs and realizations went off of things that I grew up around, seeing that we're just so normalized in every day that we didn't have the language for it. We still don't have a lot of the language and understanding for it on the border. And my friends and I still talk about it, like, oh my gosh, do you remember this in middle school or high school or so-and-so and this? And now we realize what was going on. So a couple of students talking to me about that and seeing how they can help their own parents.
That's fascinating. So when you refer to language to talk about it, are you less referring there to actual terminology, or to this whole question? Do we talk about it at all? Do
I
we
think
penetrate,
both.
penetrate denial? Do we penetrate,
Yeah.
histories or so on? Both. Okay.
It's definitely both, because there are, like I shared, the misunderstandings between language and the
Yeah.
definitions, but
Yeah.
also that normalization and that cultural understanding, especially of like migrants being told you don't have rights and this is what you signed up for. What else are you going to do?
Yeah.
You know, changing that narrative and lens. So changing the language of, yes, you do actually have rights, and you know, your experience isn't fair, and there is something that can be done about it, as well as the proper language for what it is. It wasn't that you were obligated, you were trafficked, you were exploited.
So in effect, you're helping run a program that is about human rights education,
Right.
to actual victims who don't believe they have human rights.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the connections in how when I was talking to the men in my dissertation about, you know, these guys are day laborers and they go to cantinas, and then there's, you know, women being trafficked there. And they had just a different understanding. First of all, they thought all human trafficking was for sex. And they thought, you know, the women kind of know what they're doing too. But when I asked them if they've ever faced an exploitation of labor abuse or exploitation, and they shared these situations with me, I was telling them, you know, don't you see the difference between them? And that kind of opened their mind of, oh, wait, this can happen in a labor setting as well. And, you know, the labor that the women are forced into is sexual services, you know, or being ficheras, you know, waitresses or bartenders. And so just having that understanding of, no, it's about exploitation. It's not about sex or labor. It's about exploitation and how that happens.
That too is fascinating. You're dealing with people who are focused on what's right in front of them, out of obvious imperatives and emergencies and so on, and you're trying to get them to think wider. One of our question on that issue asks here about the problem of shame that you may encounter among men in particular on the question of sex trafficking. I mean, is that a therapy question? Is that a, you know, or do you encounter that?
Yeah. So for those who have been trafficked, the shame was more of, it was a tactic used against them of like, what would your family say if they knew, you know, this was happening? So that was, shame was used as a tactic. And so therefore then it brought on this idea of, you know, that possible shame happening. What was interesting for those buying sex, this is just a hypothesis because it's not what I was looking at in my study. It just came up. It felt like it changed, you know, something clicked for the men when the women would self-identify and tell them that they were being forced or they didn't want to, or they had to do this for a reason. That it went from like, oh, this woman's a cantinera to this woman's a victim. And then like, there comes the shame, like, I can't do this to them. And then like, you know, how do I react to it? I had a lot of guys telling me that, especially if they were given a younger woman. So it goes across the board. The women also who were being exploited, I think faced a lot more of the shame tactics.
Yeah.
Because of the cultural stigma that we have, Marianismo and machismo, in the Latino community. So it's just a hypothesis of where the cultural values come into play for me.
Can I roll into this too? Those stunning numbers you now have. Did I hear it right? 122,000 minors
In shelters.
just this year.
Yeah.
For the past
last fiscal year.
And practically doubled over previous years.
I think 3 years, yeah.
Yeah. The scale of this is, I mean, you're from there, you've lived this. The scale of this is hard to get your head around for those who don't live there, is it not? I mean, that's a phenomenal number of children, unaccompanied in most.
Right, that's just the kids. That's just the kids that don't have their, their guardian.
Who arrive in the United States, their lives begin this way. There's a couple of questions here really are asking you for solutions, you know, as though, you know, you're supposed to solve this now. But in effect, they're asking what works, what can be done, not just by you, but, you know, as a person intervening, as a scholar social worker, what can be done, what should be done. And in that speech you're going to write for Vice President Harris, what should and can be done to begin to solve this vast problem that you just described?
Well, not to get political, but Vice President Harris actually went to the countries and told them to stay there, that they were going to get turned back.
She did. I know. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. What about the next speech?
Right. If I could completely write the next one, it's so multifaceted. It's so interconnected. This is a foreign policy issue. It's being treated as a border security issue.
It is a foreign policy issue. That's a very good point. If that's a war zone, it's a foreign policy issue. Right.
But migration is being treated as a border security issue. Having worked with Palestinians, we are one of the most secure borders in the world, and probably as militarized, just in a different context. It doesn't look the way we're told it looks in other places. Like I said, I talked to this woman from Palestine when we were talking about border issues and, showing pictures, and she was like, oh, that looks the same. Which was just mind blowing to hear from me, where, we're given a different rhetoric about it. This is one of the most secure borders of the world. It's not about border security. It needs to have a human rights-based approach. We have actual laws that are being broken right now, and that are the implementations we're having is unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional to have these overcrowded shelters, to having asylum-seeking camps and not letting people into their rightful process to asylum, who are being shipped to different states without resources when they have, actual sponsors that are legally binding in other states. There's so much intersection in this, but it all, to me, and this is why the class talks about the intersection of rights and risks, it needs to have a human rights-based approach. The foreign policy needs to look at not where profits come from corporations, but the community rights and how they're impacted by, transnational corporations, by foreign policies, by military bases, by everything else that we have intervention with. Also, the treaties, trade treaties, are focused on products and commerce and not labor. So there's no free movement of that labor. There's no, if we can come to your country and have these subsidies for these corporations, and, or for, what you would normally be making, but you don't have the opportunity to move somewhere else to keep the money that you were making before. It's not based on the person. This is all based on profits, and war is a profiteering issue as well. So I think there's a lot of political background to this, of who's actually looked at as a refugee, who's looked at as a child soldier, what is war, and what is, what violence, the staggering rates of violence and murders and homicides in Latin America are just excused as whatever, criminals, versus if the same were happening somewhere else. So I think it's just all interconnected, but the first thing we have to do is have a human rights-based approach, and that means breaking down and abolishing a lot of carceral responses to migration.
Wow, it sounds like you need to do more than write a speech for Vice President Harris. I mean, it sounds like Homeland Security and the State Department needs to have a gigantic reassessment of the approach.
Yeah.
Is this a human rights problem? Is it a wartime problem or not?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, or, is it just a migration problem? No, it's obviously much more than that. We have an interesting question here before we finish, from Ernesto Mercado Montero, who is wondering about the role of, you're getting asked to explain everything here, the romanticization of drug trafficking in Mexican and Chicano popular culture.
Yeah,
including music. I mean, you can't. I mean, that's probably not. Maybe that's not the highest on your policy list. But what about that?
No, but I'm from San Benito, and we're the home of conjunto music, and and corridos and narco corridos are really big back home. Well,
that's what the question says.
Yeah. So it's.
Yeah.
So this is all anecdotal. And I haven't looked into this field. I actually do know people who study, history of human rights violations or slavery within cultural contexts and the histories in like film and music. It's not my area, but I will say when you look at war zones, this is something, I came up that the political ideologies aren't very well delineated in Latin America like they do in actual conflict zones, because then it's actual like state actors that they can clearly define. and that's my question. What about nautical states when, governments are included in this violence at some level, but it's not, clearly looked at or delineated. And so a lot of communities actually do romanticize the cartels, even some of the maras, and some of the factions of the maras, the FARC in Colombia, because they've done more for the community than the government has. There were roads where I grew up going as a kid in Mexico that it used to take like 2 hours to get to, that now it's 45 minutes. And that wasn't the government. That's
an issue with Israel and its neighbors.
Right, right. That's a very desired route north. And so they fix those roads, for transport. And so there is a romanticization, and I wonder how much of it is justified by that sense of, this is people from our own community and they're getting back and they're finally fighting back, where they are giving back something. Because to me, that does have then those political ideological ties and factions, but how, they're not clearly defined like they would be in war zones of like, this is our demands and this is what's going to be met, versus what's actually happening in countering the government actions in these countries. So again, not a clear answer, but it is something I've considered and can only hypothesize about if that has something to do with,
Sure.
Political ideologies at play.
How about one last question, if you don't mind? This has been brilliant and challenging and sobering. But you are, it seems to me, a living, breathing example of something we talk a lot about now in academia, which is the trained scholar activist. It goes without saying, you're involved in research and study. It drives you. You have an academic position, but you're in the field. You're dealing with a crisis. You're dealing with real people in a real crisis. How do you think about those various roles, and how do you mix them consciously in your work? Because I think a lot of us in the academy now trying to figure this out haphazardly. How do you do it?
To me, this is my community. I feel as, first generation college student, first one in my family to, let alone go to college, become a doctor. My mom always wanted to go to school and be a professor. I kind of lived out her dream for her. Hearing the histories and everything that they went through, when I taught at UT Austin, I had kind of talked to my parents about, racism I had seen on campus, and they were like, oh, still? And I realized that Mexicans and Mexican Americans weren't even allowed to go to UT until like the 60s, so just one generation. And now I was a professor there. To me, it's personal. This is, I grew up along a border that didn't have, we had a fence after 9/11. Interestingly, nobody involved in 9/11 came through Mexico, but we then got a fence in response to it. I grew up.
That didn't stop people from claiming they did come through
Right.
Mexico. Yeah.
One of my best friends literally lived like right. My mom's house is 2 miles from the river. One of my best friends was right on the river, and we would be at her house, and people would be walking through, and her dad would offer them, food and stuff. So this is just, it is personal to me. It does impact my family. Even policies happening today where, impacting us. As someone who has the privileges of being born here, having this access to education and stakeholders, I feel it's a responsibility to my community and everyone who helped raise me and I don't just mean raising like, from as a baby, I mean like make me the person that I am. So yeah, I see it as an obligation. It's a responsibility for me.
Didn't I hear you say too, you're involved in some way with the public school system you grew up in?
Yeah, that was really cool. I was invited last year to give a training. It was mandated by the Texas Ledge for schools to have a policy on how to respond to trafficking that, might be identified in schools. So they contracted me to come and do a training for all of the counselors and help with the developing the policy for that. So that was really interesting because it filled a need for me that I didn't know I had. Like I said, growing up, you know, my friends and I look back now and now identify things. So I got to go back and say, hey, this happened and we didn't know then. You know, I had a friend who died at a labor site. I had another friend who on the weekends was going to Mexico and selling sex, you know, but we didn't have that language at the time. And now I could go back and tell them this is happening here. On top of that, I just did a statewide study with kids from here who are now, you know, in the criminal justice system because of activities that they're telling me how it started. So I can give that back to where I'm from and let you know how it's going on. So that was one of the coolest experiences I think of my career, was getting to go home and fill that.
Oh, God bless you. And if you don't mind me saying it, we're better to start than the public school.
Yeah.
And under such duress all over the United States, you know, you have to start somewhere. And you know, I'm all about public schools, and obviously so are you.
Yeah, I agree.
So, well, gosh, there are actually still more questions, but we're past 1 o'clock. A fabulous talk, Melissa, and everybody should know out there, Melissa's here for the rest of the semester. Shout out to her students and her course. Melissa will no doubt appear on a panel near you on the Yale campus, somewhere else on this subject. And again, thank you for, wow, such a sobering, honest, realistic, but inspiring explanation of this vast problem on the American border. But I'm especially struck, I'll say it one last time, at your framing of this as a war zone, and with the necessity of national policies that respond to it on that level, because I don't think we're there. Right. So Melissa, thank you, and see you around upstairs, see you around the shop, so to speak. Sure. And thank you all for coming. Great session today, and see you at tomorrow's panel. And we got, as Michelle told us all here in the webinar chat, we have numerous other talks coming up very soon. So thanks. Have a good Thursday, everybody. And especially thanks to you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well
thanks to you and the GLC. Thank you all.
Well done.